basically, it's really early in the morning and I'm in Scotland on a retreat. So this is like my pillar, and I'm in bed, and there's a lovely stone circle out the window. It's really nice. But today is also International Overdose Awareness Day, uh, and it's something that I'm really passionate about, because in the UK we have such a high number of drug related deaths, and I think from my point of view, from someone who lives in Doncaster, that's been historically heavily affected by the heroin crisis in the 1980s. This is something that affects our daily lives and something that we see on a daily basis. And I have always searched for answers around this, about drug use in my communities, and growing up in an ex-mining community as well, which is one of the worst communities affected by the heroin crisis. I've always wanted to understand more about our country and its relationships with prohibited illegal drugs, and how that's affected every aspect of our lives. So, James Pierce, my other half from Drug Train, he introduced me to Drug Wars, a book by Neil Woods, an undercover drugs cop who worked for 13 years infiltrating and busting criminal gangs associated with drugs and dealing and supply and all of that. And he left the police force and has become a drug policy reform activist. And he is passionate about telling the story of Britain and our relationship with drugs, and how how the how this has affected the police, and how and the corruption that exists within the police force now. He also believes that there's no point in police involvement with drugs, and that we should look for reform and regulating, and enabling people to choose what they do, and what they put inside their bodies. But basically, the book is an incredible guide to a lot of questions that I've had about, you know, why do we take drugs, why are they illegal, the policing around that, the heroin epidemic that affected the community where I'm from in the north of England. So basically, I wanted to do this reading and ask other drug policy reform activists to read from this book, to maybe share with our friends, family, co-workers, and get them to read this book as well. Everybody needs to read it to understand modern Britain today. So I'm just going to read, this is the preface. The observation van is parked on a rough dead-end street in Leeds, running surveillance on a high-level Bradford drug dealer. Suddenly the van is surrounded by men in balaclavas. It is tied shut, doused in petrol and set on fire. 2 cops inside barely get out alive. It was no accident that the gangsters knew there was an obs van outside their safe house that night, that they had moles inside the police feeding them information. That incident was never reported to the press, but I remember the operation well. The thought of those 2 officers trapped inside the burning vehicle stuck with me. It forced me to once again ask myself a gnawing question: how has it come to this? I've lost my place. How has it come to the point where the police come under attack because their own systems have been corrupted? This wasn't the first time on the force I'd experienced high-level corruption. When I was working undercover in Nottingham, my own unit had been infiltrated by the psychopathic drugs kingpin Colin Gunn. Gunn had hired a 19-year-old kid named Charles Fletcher to join the police force, with specific instructions to get into CID. For years, Gunn paid Fletcher $2,000 a month on top of his police salary to pass intelligence on about our investigations. When I confronted my superiors about this, I was met with a shrug. With so much money in the drugs game, how can corruption not happen? It got to the point that the drug investigations, police corruption had just become an accepted part of the game. How has it come to this? On another major operation, the first lawful order we received was that under no circumstances were we to speak to anyone from Greater Manchester Police, and that if anyone from GMP approached us, we were to immediately report it. We were forced to work under the assumption that a major British police force was so riddled with moles and informants that any contact with them whatsoever was suspect. How has it come to this? That question stuck me throughout my final years in the force. It continued to trouble me even after I left the police and tried to dedicate my life to undoing some of the harm that I had caused. Then, we published the book Good Cop, Bad War. The response to Good Cop, Bad War hit me for 6. We started receiving letters and emails from all over the country and from people around the world. There were messages from cops and ex-cops, addicts and family members of addicts, drug dealers serving in prisons who had read the book in the prison library. These were all people who had experienced the war on drugs firsthand from both sides of the battle line. Somehow, what we had written in Good Cop resonated with their experience. This outpouring of support and encouragement was both humbling and profoundly inspiring. Then one letter came through that stopped me in my tracks. It was from a young man named Adam, whose parents had both been intravenous heroin users. Adam spent his childhood caught up in the chaotic mess of overdose and arrests that often define the drug users under the system of prohibition. He spoke of witnessing the beatings his parents received at the hands of ruthless gangsters. He remembers seeing his desperation and shame in their eyes of not knowing, even as a child, what they needed was just help, support, understanding, not prison and judgment. Adam wrote of how he watched the arms race of the drug wars unfold, how it got more and more violent and more difficult. He wrote this war wasn't going to be won with force, arrest, prison and isolation. He wrote of having to watch his own mother being forced to drink petrol over a £20 drug debt. Again, that question, how has it come to this? In the face of Adam's letter and hundreds more like it, I decided I would finally try and answer that question. We didn't get here by accident. The situation Adam, myself and thousands of others got caught up in is the war on drugs, and we have found ourselves in it. It is a result of a very specific decision taken over decades, and these decisions need to be looked at. The British war on drugs is almost 60 years old. To explain how it functions, you need to look back at its roots. This is a story that has never been told until now. On Good Cop, Bad War, I worked closely with the writer J.R.S. Rafeli. Throughout that process, we began to ask the questions about the wider meaning and the personal story we were telling. How did the war on drugs develop? What impact has it had on British policing and law enforcement? What can this tell us about the relationship between the individual and the state? On a personal level, considering these questions turned out to be invaluable in helping me to begin to understand the process of PTSD from which I now suffer since leaving the police. So we decided to take this new project together by combining my inside perspective of the police with J.R.'s skills as a historian and journalist. We could confidently approach this hugely complex story. This book is a completely equal joint effort between us. It has been an incredibly challenging but rewarding process for both of us. The first thing we decided is that we needed to talk to people. All too often when discussing drug policy, the conversation gets caught up in statistics and vague political ideas. It's academics arguing with politicians, arguing with cops, and everyone loses sight of the fact that behind the number lies real people with real stories. We wanted these stories to be heard. We wanted them to be brought back into conversation. So we spent months going up and down the country interviewing every drug dealer, cop, addicts, health workers, activists and politicians, getting to the truth of what the British war on drugs has meant to the people who've actually fought it. We met some extraordinary people. We cannot thank each and every one of them enough for their courage and generosity in sharing their experiences with us. By necessary, we have had to edit those interviews for flow and brevity, but it is absolutely their story. Each chapter in this book from the 1960s to the present day covers themes that have been written about in depth by specialists and academics. We are building on their efforts and could not have begun to put this story together without the work they have done. However, this discussion is often only happens in academic circles. This book is meant for everyone, because this is a history that everyone should know. The war on drugs happens on the streets, and it's time to take our story out there too. The most successful drug cartel in the history was not run by a Colombian cocaine baron, a Mexican trafficking gang, or an Afghan warlord. It was run by the British state. Throughout the 19th century, the East Indian Company, backed by British military power, ran simultaneous monopolies on opium in China and hashish in India. In his wildest dreams, Pablo Escobar never got anywhere close. In the 1990s, when Tony Blair handed Hong Kong back to China, he was handing back the spoils of a 19th century drug war. At home, it was a different story. The original substance-based moral panics in Britain were probably the gin crazes that intermittently rocked the country through the 18th and 19th centuries. Each of these crises produced a tabloid outcry and the calls for gin to be banned outright. Each time, however, these calls were resisted. That was not the British way. Successive governments, including those led by conservative icons like the Duke of Wellington, chose to deal with the gin problem through regulation and licensing, not through law enforcement. This fitted with a deep-rooted British tradition of liberal pragmatism, and by and large it worked. In terms of the modern war on drugs, Britain has never matched the violence of the United States or Latin America, yet the UK occupies a unique and crucial place in history in this global conflict. Britain is historically the country that has offered the most consistent and coherent alternative to the American-led war on drugs. If there's one essential discovery we made in trying to answer this question, how has it come to this? It's that the war on drugs is fundamentally an un-British thing. This is very much lost in history. Most people in Britain aren't even aware of it, but they should be. This book is an attempt to reclaim this vital thread in our nation's story. The war on drugs has caused chaos and suffering across the globe. This is the story of its British front, from how a tiny beginning things have grown and metastasized into a terrifying force that corrupts the very heart of the criminal justice system. We believe this is a story that every British person should know. It speaks to many aspects of us who we are as a country, but beyond that, our hope and belief in writing this book is that the story of the British experience of the war on drugs can offer an insight to all those who have been affected by it throughout the world. Neil Woods, 2019. Thank you if you've listened all the way through that. If you are interested in this, then please buy this book and read it. It'll change your life. And if you're a drug policy reform activist, please read a chapter from this and share it on your social media. The numbers of drug-related deaths in the UK is going to come out in October, so it'd be great to build some momentum building up to that date. So if you can share this with your friends and colleagues, then we can all really, as a country, look at that number and what it means. Thank you for listening. Much love, Rachel.